Amotai over here in Australia. So please feel free to interrupt me at any point in time with some questions that you want to ask me. There's nothing off the table. I'll be really open and really honest about the challenges we've had, some of the good news stories, I'm probably preaching to the converted. There will be a lot of stuff here that you're probably already doing or have already done, and so apologies in advance if it feels like I'm kind of preaching and telling you stuff that you already know. But this is just a little bit of our journey and how we've gone about it. Yeah, so without kind of any more wasting, I've got a little bit of a presentation. There's only a couple of slides, or probably about 5 or 6 slides in there. But yeah, happy to kind of do that. So let me see how good my technology is going.
You've got access to the share button. Beautiful, mate. Awesome. All yours.
Can everybody see that? Cool. Yeah, so just as I said, Anna kind of asked me to come and have a bit of a chat about our kind of First Nations engagement. But what I'll start by doing is doing an acknowledgement to country. So pretty similar to what I understand the karakia is over there. We in Australia do an acknowledgement to country. So this is our kind of official script. I generally don't say anything like that, but I kind of just acknowledge that I am today on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people here in Naarm, which is the Aboriginal name for Melbourne. I did grow up in the Northern Territory, as I said, in an Aboriginal community, and was really, really lucky enough to actually grow up with people that were first contact. I remember having a conversation with a really old man who's the first time that he actually saw a non-Aboriginal person was probably, unfortunately, a Japanese fighter pilot that had been shot down on their way to bomb Darwin in the early 1930s. So really, really fascinating place to grow up in. And I feel kind of really honoured that and blessed that I was able to get that kind of experience. So, just acknowledging that traditional custodians on probably both of our lands have continuing connection to land, sea and culture. I know in Australia we're quite envious of how ingrained culture is in the school system and the education system over there. It's not quite as ingrained as here. I just want to pay my respects to any elders on the call, any elders that are past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are probably not on the call today, but definitely around the country on which I live and work. I extend that respect to all of you across in our neighbouring country as well in New Zealand. Probably a little bit to have a chat about a bit of a history lesson, right? Because Wilson has been on this journey for kind of a really long time, all the way back since 2016, and that it probably came about because in 2016, the federal government in Australia implemented what they call the Indigenous Procurement Policy, which basically mandated that any government contract that was let out had to have some employment and or procurement opportunities for First Nations people. And I think in some cases, regardless of how you start, at least it's making a start. So Wilson, had that policy. They wanted to get more government contracts, so they just started this journey about in getting a First Nations engagement plan. They launched their Reconciliation Action Plan. I'll go into what a Reconciliation Action Plan is in the next kind of slide. And they did a lot of work around engaging with remote communities because, to be frank, Wilson Security and Wilson Parking, they're not industries that First Nations people want to aspire to or would want to work in, primarily because in the security industry, particularly most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, if you're in Coles or Woolworths, you're generally followed around the store thinking that you're going to steal someone by a security officer, right? So it's a really challenging space for Aboriginal people to work in. So we did a lot of work around the kind of community engagement piece. We developed a program called Making Tracks. Again, I'll kind of outline a little bit about what that is a bit later. And I was employed in 2020 to actually, because what had happened in the first iteration of our Reconciliation Action Plan, which finished in 2019, my predecessor, an Aboriginal man by the name of Jimmy Mai, left the business, and it got buried in a function around HR, right? So there was no one to really drive it across the whole Wilson group. I came in at a bit more senior level to then actually kind of really drive processes and policy improvement across the group. You can kind of see down the bottom there that our employment was not really good, and neither was our Indigenous business participation across the group. But we did launch our very first Indigenous procurement strategy in 2020 with the Wilson Security business on its own, not necessarily across the whole of the Wilson Group. In 2021, we were at a kind of critical juncture around. I talked to the CEO and said, well, I can either drive strategy implementation, look after our reconciliation action plan, or I can go the other way and support the 70 odd Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people we had in our business. We kind of need to make a choice. And so we chose that I would continue down the strategic pathway, and I employed 3 Aboriginal people to work underneath me, whose sole responsibility was to work with all of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff and ensure that their employment journey was as smooth as humanly possible. We, through that Making Tracks program, worked with a lot of people in, I suppose, the employment system who had complex barriers to employment when they first started. So we kind of just needed people to help them on that journey. We set a pretty ambitious target, you can see there in 2022, about getting to 200 employees by the end of FY24. But our employment had increased at the same time. If I kind of fast forward to 2023, we developed our second reconciliation action plan. And then through our program of Making Tracks in the security business, I think we'd had more than 100 people go through that program, which is pretty amazing. And then if we kind of got to 2025, we are currently sitting at 3.2% or 3.19% employment, which represents actually 257 people across our group at the moment. In Australia, the population of Aboriginal Australia sits at around 3% as per the kind of census data. So getting to 3%, which is employment parity, is a goal for pretty much every organisation. And then from a procurement perspective, it says approximately 2% there. I'll explain why it says approximately 2% in a minute. But you can see that we've made really great strides around a procurement and employment piece. Our reconciliation action plan actually expires at the end of this month, so we're now in the process of negotiating another reconciliation action plan. I'll just do a quick pause there. Any questions at all? Anna, excellent. So the Wilson Group in Australia is about 7,500 people, 4 different business units. So you have Wilson Security, which is where the majority of people are. There's about 6,500 in Wilson Security. And then there's Wilson Parking. They also have a small self-storage business called Wilson Storage, only has about 50 people in it. And in the west of the country, in Western Australia, they have a patient transport business called Wilson Medic One as well. So 7,500 people kind of all up. And our Aboriginal population makes up 257 of that. And of that, 30% of our First Nations employees are actually female, which is actually another great result, because across our industries, the average female participation rate is about 15 to 18%. So we're kind of doubled that as well. Cool. Just some stats. So as I said, these are, and I've been totally honest here about where we're at, right? So 3.19% procurement. You can see across there that security has the majority of the people. So they have the highest percentage, and other parts of the business don't have any. An organisation like storage that has 50 people, it's really hard to find people in that kind of sense sometimes. From a procurement perspective, you can see there we've just ticked over $7.6 million this financial year. And whilst that doesn't sound like a lot, we can't compete with a construction business or a government kind of entity, a local council that could potentially be doing tens of millions of dollars. We're able to maximise what we can do, though, through our procurement processes. So we do a lot of work with Aboriginal-owned security companies. As a Wilson Group, we've engaged an Aboriginal office supplier. So they do all of our stationery, all of the tea, coffee, office furniture, you name it, they are our office supplier across the Wilson Group in Australia. And we do some other really, really cool things about uniform supply as well. Purchase of vehicles. There's actually an Aboriginal business that now has part ownership of a Toyota dealership, so, and we purchase all our vehicles, so we purchase it through them. So, just been really targeted around how we go around that procurement piece. And the reason why we're saying approximately there is the other three parts of the business only report yearly, whereas the security business actually report quarterly. So now that we finish the financial year, I'll get the yearly responses from the other parts of the business. And that's primarily because they are less advanced in their journey than the security business. The security business has been on the journey since 2016, really, so they're really quite advanced. And I have to kind of run at a two-speed corporate process, right? Because an organisation like Wilson Medic One, you can see there, they've only just received a contract with the Department of Health in WA, and it's their first ever contract that has mandated targets in it, and that was a year ago. So outside of that, I've had to rely on people's goodwill in order to take on some of this work because they don't have mandated targets, right? So, and I'll talk a little bit about the Reconciliation Action Plan and how I've utilised the Reconciliation Action Plan to ensure we have that goodwill, I suppose, and the buy-in. So yeah, the Reconciliation Action Plan, just probably, there's an organisation that was established in 2001 in Australia called Reconciliation Australia. They're the national peak body to handle the Reconciliation Action Plan process. These are what they call the 5 dimensions of reconciliation. And whenever you do a reconciliation action plan, you have to kind of address these 5 dimensions in the actions and deliverables that you're committing to as an organisation. It's just a bit of background for you. They're kind of all interrelated in one way, shape or form. And so you can't really do equality and equity without having historical acceptance of what's happened in this country. Unlike so the true history of what I suppose you could call Aboriginal Australia is actually still not taught in the education system at all in Australia. So it's not mandated in the curriculum. Schools can choose to teach the Aboriginal history, but for the most part, all we learn about is when Captain Cook landed and then all the non-Aboriginal and non-First Nations history from there. You would never hear in a school context that across Australia between 1788 and 1938, there were approximately 250 massacres across Australia of Aboriginal people. Most people don't know that, right? So, yeah, it's really, really interesting about how that works. So when you do a framework for the RAP, you have to identify where you kind of sit. You generally start at the reflect level, which kind of, as it says, prepares your organisation. You then move into innovate, you then go to stretch and then elevate. Interestingly, across Australia, there's 2,200 approximately organisations who have a reconciliation action plan. 1,200 of them sit in that reflect stage. 917 sit in the innovate stage. 155 sit in the stretch stage, and there's only 14 at that elevate stage. So in order to progress through these levels of the RAP, it actually takes quite a lot of work. And most people will sit at that innovate level stage for 3, maybe 4 iterations of your RAP. So that could take up to 10 years, right, to do that. So it's really about the reconciliation piece is non-linear. You can't just say, we're going to draw this line and it's going to go like that. It's generally up and down and up and down, and probably pretty similar, I would imagine, to how government policy changes in New Zealand, and differing CEOs and executive leaders will have differing levels of interest, I suppose you could say, in the reconciliation process. Yeah. So what we've been able to do through our RAP is identify deliberate actions, and for an example, one action in our RAP was to make sure that all of our executive leadership team undertook training around racism and how that impacts people in the workplace. They undertook training around the historical context of Australia and the real history of Australia. So we had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses come in and deliver that for us, so that they became champions of, or at least have an understanding of, why reconciliation is important and how that links to business outcomes. So in a couple of contexts, if you have a really good solution around employment and procurement like we have, you actually win more contracts from government and or local government and state government. That increases your revenue, then increases your profit, right? So in order to do that, we had to teach people why that was important. So we did a lot of that space in the initial phases. And then we went into things like designing the Indigenous procurement strategy in security first. There is now one across the whole group for parking and those other 3 businesses. We designed a recruitment and retention strategy as well, and a few other key kind of documents that I'll go into now. And we called them the building blocks, right? Because I think without these building blocks in your organization, it's really, really hard to then move forward through that reconciliation process. These are how many are there? 6 building blocks. And we kind of did them in this order specifically, primarily because you need to start at a certain point. So you heard me do the acknowledgement to country previously in the presentation today. That's about really promoting the importance of acknowledging First Nations people, because historically they have been part of Australia's history, right? So why do leaders need to do that? We did some training and actually got an organisation to come in and teach, rather than reading off that script that you saw, teach leaders to actually personalise their acknowledgement to country a bit like I did, and try and identify why they would engage in this process. And then we developed the calendar of events, because there's across Australia probably 12 to 15 really significant days in Australia's calendar that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people support. And then we celebrate that as an organisation as well. Now, it doesn't have to be a morning tea or something that we do all the time. And there's some weeks. We just finished what they call NAIDOC Week, which is the National Aboriginal Indigenous Days of Observance Committee Week. That's been running for about 25 years. Generally, we have speakers come in. I ran a quiz night on Friday afternoon to really kind of differ the way we actually try to get people to engage in these events. But sometimes it's just an email out or an intranet article that goes out to our business to say, this is a significant day for Aboriginal people. It was the day that Kevin Rudd, who was the then Prime Minister, apologised to the Aboriginal people in 2008 for the historical atrocities that had happened in Australia. So that may just be an email or an intranet article that goes out with the links to so people can understand a bit more and do those things. We then spoke about the cultural learning plan. So we had an Aboriginal business come in and do an assessment of the Wilson organisation, and from a cultural perspective, how culturally safe are we as an organisation? What kind of things do we need to do around training our people to understand more about Australia's history, et cetera, et cetera. We've now enacted that plan and have started the process of running virtual sessions bi-monthly for all staff to really get an understanding of how they can become an ally, the impacts of racism in the workplace, and how you move from just being an ally to then start thinking about this on a day-to-day basis when you're interacting both in community, because we have a lot of staff that are interacting with the community on a daily basis through paramedics, through security officers, through car park attendants. And so how can they interact in the community in a culturally appropriate way? And then we kind of went into that Indigenous recruitment and retention procurement strategy. They're pretty self-explanatory, really. And then the last one is about a community engagement framework, which we didn't actually tick off in this wrap, so we're moving it to the next one. But ideally, what I'd like to be able to do is do myself out of a job, right? So for me, the engagement framework is a document that people can reference on the either intranet or via in a hard copy, that if they want to know how to go about engaging with the community, then they have a reference point to do that. And it's almost like a step-by-step guide that says, do you understand who the traditional owners of that country are? Once you understand who the traditional owners are through Google or other search means, how do you engage with them? So, okay, so this is how you would engage with that community. Now, all of those plans are interlinked, because you would then know how to do an acknowledgement to country when you go and meet with those organisations. You would be culturally competent because you've been through our cultural training to understand how to engage appropriately. And now this is just giving you the tools to say, this is how you email, this is who you need to include, this is who you need to engage with in that context. Okay, I feel like I've done a lot of talking. So that's my presentation. Right, so I'll stop sharing that. So I apologise for talking at you for that kind of 20 minutes. Hopefully I didn't bore everybody. It looks we've still got the same amount of people on the call, so that's a good start. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask me at all?
Thanks, Chris. I'll jump in with a first question. In our conversation to prepare for this webinar, you talked about some of the specific procurement tactics that you're using to grow spend with across the organisation. Can you just share a little bit more about what you've done there?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So one of the things was we did, as procurement professionals, I'm sure you'll all know, we just called it forward procurement planning. So we went into every different business unit. I went and sat with the CEO and the finance department, had a look at all of the different spend categories in their profit and loss statement, basically, and kind of said, okay, based on my knowledge, here is where we could include an Aboriginal business. Here is where there's an Aboriginal business that you probably couldn't include. So in the parking business, for example, Wilson Parking actually lease or manage a lot of the car parks. They don't own them, right? So they pay rent to organisations like GPT or Dexus or Mirvac, Charter Hall. I'm not sure if those names resonate with you guys over there, but they pay a rent. So you have to exclude rent from what we call your addressable spend because there's no Aboriginal businesses that they don't own the car parks, right? It'd be great if some Aboriginal businesses did and Aboriginal organisations owned a car park, but at this point in time, they don't. So you kind of take rent out of what we're looking at in terms of where can we purchase from suppliers. Now you do that through the profit and loss statement. That gives you what we then call your addressable spend or discretionary spend. So I did that for all 4 different business units, and they now have a list of, say, the security business, for example, will have a list of 15 spend categories. Somewhere like Wilson Storage has a list of 5. And that could be marketing, it could be uniform supply, it could be commercial cleaning, office supplies, obviously, as I spoke about before, security subcontractors. And that every time you go out to tender or you go to get a quote, you then have to include an Aboriginal business as a part of your quoting and your tender process. If you're going out to a really big tender, you then also have to ask, sort of multi-million-dollar tender, in your tender documentation, you have to ask things like, do people have a reconciliation action plan or do suppliers? Do they have a policy around employment of First Nations people? Do they have a policy around procuring goods and services from First Nations people? And then that becomes part of your evaluation criteria as well, with an appropriate weighting somewhere between the 5 to 15% mark in the criteria. So you're not just evaluating on price, you're evaluating on value for money, which in some cases is not the cheapest price, right? So we became really targeted in that way about how we went out and did that. And then my role in that whole piece, outside of doing the work around the procurement and the planning, was then going out and identifying appropriate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses that could become part of the supply chain. So then I introduced them to the operations managers or the procurement managers to start that process of developing a relationship, so that it's not a transactional relationship, it becomes more of a partnership type relationship. I hope that answers the question, Emma.
Yeah, it really does. Thank you. Could you just give us an example, like a business that you've engaged through that process, and what's the difference?
Most corporate entities really just like a transaction. So you do a tender or you get a quote, you deliver the service, and away you go. Once that's finished, that's it. You kind of cease that contract, right? The way Aboriginal businesses generally work and is that we and they would like to develop a partnership a bit more long term. So particularly in the space of government contracts, we've partnered with a company over in WA called Eon Protection, who are a Aboriginal owned security company, and we've been partnering with them for 7 years. So the first start of the partnership was they would just subcontract to Wilson Security on certain little tenders or certain work that we were doing, and they were just part of our subcontractor network. As the partnership has matured, though, we've gone into joint tendering on certain organisations and certain contracts, and have a joint profit share matrix, I suppose you could call it, where in the security business they have what's called lines. So they might mean 1 by 24 or 2 by 24, which means you need to have 2 full-time guards for a 24-hour period. Now, that doesn't mean that those guards are working 24 hours a day, but you might have 6 people working across those 24 hours. But what happens is most security contracts are sitting between that kind of 4 to 10 full-time lines across 24 hours. For Eon Protection, it means that we give them 2 of those full-time lines, and they have to source the people, they have to fill the shifts, they take all the risk and all the profit out of that. So we contract them on a zero margin base, so we don't take any margin on what they do. They take all of the profit out of that contract for those lines that they fill. So that's one example. In the parking space, at the beginning of the year, we got an Aboriginal commercial cleaning business. We went out to tender, and the Aboriginal commercial cleaning business was the most successful, and they now do all the commercial cleaning in all the car parks in Victoria, which is approximately 120 odd car parks. And they won that just on the back of going out to tender. Now, in that process, we've had a 6-month handover with the incumbent, and then we are also then looking at now offering them a bit more work as more car parks come into the portfolio, because that then extends their capacity and capability through that as well. So a couple of different options in the way we've done it. And my role in that is I kind of introduce the relationship first, hand that kind of over to the operational teams, but I become the lender of last resort, right? So if there's an issue in the partnership that can't be resolved with the operations team, those Aboriginal businesses can come to me and say, hey, can you help me do this? Because there's messaging going wrong here, and we don't think we're being treated fairly, or however else you want to, any other kind of issues that might arise, which unfortunately probably happens a bit more than I want, because the business is still looking at this transactional type relationship arrangement. It takes time for us to develop it as a more partnership based.
Thanks for that, Chris. I've got a couple of questions here you might have seen in the chat, but just picking up on something, one of those examples, and it kind of does lead into some of the other questions from the chat. But you talked about that zero margin relationship that you do with what did it take to get that across the line? Because that's a huge shift. But then that also leads into Junior's question, right? And Junior's question around, how important was it for you to have support at the senior leadership level? And do you believe you'd be where you are if you didn't have that support? So, and then very closely linked, but maybe a little bit different, but a lot of internal getting buy-in. And I wrote a note when you were talking about your journey. I was like, goodwill and buy-in. What are some key factors that help to enlist the staff to join the movement? So there's a lot of whakaaro or thoughts around how do we get other people to how do we get other people on the bandwagon, and then is that a key element of getting that zero margin across the line for you guys? So just kind of talk us through the importance of internal people and buy-in and how that supports you.
I'll start off by probably swearing, but not swearing. And frankly, some of it comes down to verbal diarrhea, if I'm being honest, right? So every chance I get, I talk about supply diversity all the time. And if I overhear someone in the hallway at those water cooler conversations that I have talking about, oh, we're going out and we're renovating our office, and we've found this electrician that was great. And I'm like, oh, and I'll just say, oh, did you know there's like in Victoria, there's probably 25 Aboriginal electricians as well. Like, oh, no, I didn't know that. I said, well, next time you do this, why don't you come and talk to me? Because then I can help you introduce that. And that's, particularly if it's one of the spend categories, I'll just say, hey, did we do this, right? So there's a lot of that water cooler conversation, verbal diarrhea that I have at both the executive level and the operational level. You're right, Junior, without that executive level buy-in, I wouldn't have a chance in hell of actually implementing a lot of the stuff that I've implemented. And I have really great buy-in at that executive level, primarily because the governance structure that we've put around the Reconciliation Action Plan, we have the 4 CEOs of the 4 Australian business units sitting at the top level of that governance structure. They help me design the Reconciliation Action Plan. They approve the procurement strategy and the retention strategy, recruitment and retention strategy. They will approve the community engagement framework. All of those building blocks we were talking about, ultimately they approve. We then have another level of governance where it probably drops down to like a chief operating officer level or a general manager level. They then push those policies out to the business. So those 2 levels of governance, I've got great buy-in. Honestly, the level down from that, I've got probably bugger all buy-in, unless I'm physically talking to someone. So we've had to go down this path, and not had to. I've been able to influence going down the path of starting to get those types of targets put into people's job descriptions and performance frameworks. So particularly in the security business and the parking business now, most, I suppose, middle management will have a target that says, in your business, you need to make sure that 1% of any contracts that you procure are with a First Nations business. And that's part of their performance framework, which in some cases, not all cases, is linked to their bonus. Money talks, right? So when people are linking stuff to their bonus and it doesn't happen, they kind of get really invested in making it happen. So that's another way that we've been able to do it from a structural perspective, is really actually going back to the basics again and saying, all right, this needs to become part of this level's job description. And if they are on a performance framework, it becomes into their performance framework as well. In the security business, we have targets around employment of Aboriginal people for state managers, so we'll say in Queensland, for example, I think this year we've asked them, they've got 42 people and we've given them a target of 60 for this year for the state manager of the security business. So if he doesn't meet that KPI, he doesn't get his bonus. It's kind of, yeah. Did that kind of cover all of the answers? Just trying to read them now. So Debbie, I suppose internally, it's a combination of a lot of different functions, I suppose. Obviously, procurement, you're either working with procurement professionals, commercial managers, or finance, depending on how your business is structured. Funnily enough, Wilson doesn't have a procurement function in it. So all the procurement is decentralized, which does make it a little bit easier in some cases, because it means I can go directly to a purchaser and say, hey, I need you to do this, which is how I got the Victorian commercial cleaning contract across the line, because I went directly to the operational general manager who was running that tender and said, hey, why don't we try this in the parking business, because it is a Reconciliation Action Plan item that we need to meet 1%. The business currently is sitting underneath 1%, and this would push them over the edge. And he went, cool, okay, no worries. So I kind of linked that to him being able to, because I know a part of the strategy for the Victorian parking business is to go to the Victorian government and try and get them as an account, right? And the Victorian government has lots of policy around Indigenous employment or Aboriginal employment and procurement. And so if we already have a solution in-house, that then becomes part of our tender process with the Victorian government, and then shows that we're already doing it. It's not something that we're committing to do. We already have a solution because we've already done it. And so it sets us apart from our competitors when we come to that response.
Thanks for that one, Chris. this next one with Hilda, and I might circle back after this one. Really good question around the monitoring and tracking of your targets and recruitment. Yeah, talk us through, how you guys go about that in some of your strong divisions of Wilson Group.
Yeah, I think it's the different levels of maturity around reporting. And we had a big project in this wrap to develop a dashboard, Power BI, really, really similar to what has already been developed in the security industry. The challenge that we had is that the business decided to change finance systems halfway through our wrap period. So that just kind of, the 6 months of work that I had done with the finance team had just gone completely out the window. So in the security business, which is the most advanced, we have a Power BI dashboard that goes to all the senior leaders in their business on a monthly basis. I get a report out of the HR system, which we use SuccessFactors. I can run that report whenever I want, but I generally run it monthly. I hand that over to the Power BI dashboard people and kind of say, all right, turn that into the KPI matrix, either the number of Aboriginal people we've got employed and also the percentage of what that looks like. We do some metrics around retention of people as well. From a procurement perspective, one of the first things I did when we got here was have a look at the finance system to make sure that there are flags in the system to identify Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses. Probably nothing new to you guys, but also not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses, different certification models of what they could be. So Supply Nation, which is Amotai's equivalent, they have a Supply Nation registered business and a Supply Nation certified business. And then in each state, there's generally an Aboriginal Chamber of Commerce as well. So we've added that as a flag. And we do quite a lot of work with Aboriginal traditional owner groups as well, which are not really captured in any of those previous certifications. So we've had another certificate or another flag in our business that calls Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisation, for want of a better description. So once we put that into the finance system, that meant that monthly I can run reports to say, okay, how many Aboriginal businesses have we done that with? That also gets included in the Power BI report. Yeah, so it's a mixture of Power BI, Excel, the finance system, the HR system, and trying to tie them all together, frankly. And I'm trying to get as far away from Excel as I can. But given the new finance system, I've got to work with it for a bit longer.
Yeah, the overlap of the different systems, always a challenging prospect in regards to what we're trying to generate for these outcomes and things. Thanks, Hilts. Junior's just come back in around, Wilson Group NZ. And I actually remember thinking about this at the beginning as well, is Wilson Group the same? I was trying to remember like the parking signs and stuff. I think there's like Wilson Parking and things here. But yeah, what are the dynamics about Wilson Group NZ and Oz? And to Junior's question, is Wilson NZ active, or are they looking? How are they looking?
Yeah, they're not a member of Amotai at the moment. I do know that much. The security business, the CEO there is really, really quite interested in this space. He has a cultural advisor that's come in to advise the business, and he's been able to actually develop Wilson, or they call it First Security in New Zealand. They actually have their own karakia that they've developed for the business, and he will talk about that constantly and actually deliver that in all of his meetings, etc., etc. So First Security in New Zealand is very, very interested in this space. It probably hasn't transformed into official policies around procurement and supplier diversity. And I think my role is purely Australian based at the moment. But from a broader corporate social responsibility, both the security business and the parking business do a lot around working with social enterprises, sponsorships of certain organisations, etc., etc. But they probably, just haven't really turned it into specific action like we have here in Australia.
Anna's put in there that First Security, as a member of Amotai. I'm guessing they might be one of the lower level members of, because I don't know if any of our suppliers, buyer relationship managers have engaged with them yet. So yeah, that'd be an interesting quarter. Or we'll have to share this video with them and be like, hey man, we've got some great expertise across the ditch you could pull in, and we're here to help support your growth and development as well. Just another question from one of our team members here. It must be frustrating to have senior management support, yet middle managers not delivering on a diverse supplier strategy and or committing to delivering on spend targets. Is the linking of KPIs working, and are there other strategies that are working to get that buy-in?
Yeah, I think it's worked from that senior management level because that's the first level that we put those KPIs into. We haven't yet been successful to probably put it into the middle managers yet. But that is a converse, and not in all organizations either, by the way. So the parking business, for example, last year didn't want to put anything into KPIs, but this year they will. So again, it's one of those works in progress. It is frustrating in some cases. And if you can get to one-on-one with people, then you generally find that they will do that verbal diarrhea conversation. But probably, as much as we've got the building blocks in place, we probably still haven't nailed the structure on how that structurally looks across all levels of the organisation, if I'm being really frank. And that's probably just a function of a lack of time and capacity to actually really invest in that, if I'm being honest. Because as much as it's all part of Wilson Group, the 4 businesses still run as very, very separate entities, and are pretty siloed. So when I've got to have conversations, I can try and have these conversations about a reconciliation action plan that covers the whole group. But then I've also got to go and have another conversation with the senior leadership team just to make sure that the conversation we had at that group level is filtering down to that individual business. So there's just some challenges around making it business as usual, frankly, because it a bit like safety was 10, 15 years ago, it still hasn't really become a normal part of conversation all of the time. That idea of what value for money means is still very much price driven in the organisation, and it just takes a long time to have those discussions around value for money. And yeah.
Thanks for that, brother. Junior said here, setting KPIs relating for supply diversity at any level is a significant win. So you guys are doing some awesome stuff over there. And then also just a quick comment here from Sarah. She's like, hey, we'd love to have you come and see what we're up to over here in August. We've got our Supplier Diversity Summit, where we've got some really interesting corridor happening on an international level with our Supply Nation and other Indigenous intermediary cousins, and how things have been impacting lately. So if you do get that opportunity, we'd love to see you over here in person as well. I had a quick question. It might be just quite logistical or simple to answer, but you talked about the phases, right? The reconciliation phases. And I was just wondering there, first of all, are those like, you had some numbers behind them. So are different organizations, based on, what they're submitting as a part of their app and I guess executing, are they allocated to that phase, or is it a self-identified, self-assessed type space?
It's a negotiation with Reconciliation Australia. So they will, particularly at the first 2 levels, Reflect and Innovate, they have templates, and they have some mandatory criteria or actions and deliverables that you have to deliver in those 2 years. And so you then kind of negotiate over and above that what you want to do as an organisation. You know what I mean? So it's a bit of a negotiation. When you get to the top 2 levels of Stretch and Elevate, it then becomes a bit more of a self-identified, this is what we're going to continue to do, because you're taking a leadership position around that. Whereas the first 2 levels are a bit more around, okay, you must develop a cultural learning plan, for example, you know what I mean? You must incorporate KPIs into your reconciliation action plan. So it becomes a lot more structured, and it's a bit of a negotiation. But then you kind of have to look at the business and what their objectives are to then identify the other parts that aren't mandatory. You know what I mean? So in the context of, say, Wilson Medic One, right? Which is the patient transport business. They're also a registered training organisation. And so they deliver training to trained paramedics or patient transport drivers. But there's not very many Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in that industry at all. So I've been able to negotiate with Wilson Medic One to offer 2 scholarships per year in Certificate 3 in non-emergency patient transport, which is the pathway into being a paramedic. So, you know, that costs about $5,000 or $6,000 per course, and I think it's a 2 to 3 week course. So twice a year, they will identify an Aboriginal person, they will go through that process, and that's their way of contributing to the reconciliation effort, because they are actually increasing the representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the health sector, right? So
amazing.
Yeah. So it's just, you know, you've really got to nail down what each business priorities are and how they can contribute in that way.
Beautiful. I was thinking about, I remember when I first saw my first wrap, and I was like, wow, this is such a great document. And for us here in New Zealand, we launched I guess a bit of an introductory space of a wrap, because it is very much focused on procurement space as opposed to the wider scope of a wrap, you know, the employment and the Indigenous representation and things like that, cadetships or traineeships. And so the Te Riki Tai framework that we offer our buyer members kind of helps them to acknowledge where they're at, you know. And if we were looking at some of the different phases that you talked about, you know, I'd say, you know, a good bunch of our group are in that reflective and innovative. I'd say half in the reflective and innovative stage, and maybe a couple that are going into that stretch that have been around, like you said, been around supply diversity for a while, because it takes a long time to really get this thing moving. But yeah, definitely an opportunity to expand. I know we've always thought about what is the next space of Te Riki Tai, but it is very much focused on the supplier diversity and procurement aspect of what we're trying to engage here. So maybe we can flick what that looks like over to you, and you can have a look and see if there's any of help. Like the Supply Nation whānau have said that this is a cool framework. So yeah, that's been a bit of a tap on the back for us. It's been great.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. I know in Australia they designed a program called Career Trackers, which is about giving internships for Aboriginal university students into corporate organisations.
Awesome.
And from memory, there's a very similar organisation in New Zealand. I haven't been in contact in that part of the world for a long time. Yes, that's it.
I'd say it'd be Tipu Toa. Yeah, they support Māori Pacifica Islanders into corporate spaces, which has been pretty cool. Yeah.
So all of those types of programs are amazing.
Hey, I did see a question, but I think it's kind of been taken off. So I think we might be coming to the end there and just acknowledging that we're 3 minutes before the time. I just want to check in with Anna. Is there anything you'd like to share before we close off at all, Anna?
Just a huge mihi to you, Chris. Ngā mihi nui e hoa for your time and support. And it's really amazing to see that Wilson, to hear more about the Wilson Group journey, and that Wilson Group is in for the long haul.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna Jane. I hope people got something out of it. Just like I said, I think we're all preaching to the converted on this call, so I didn't really want to tell people how to suck eggs, but I hope you got something out of it.
No, beautiful. And I'm sure the buyers on the call, and even us in the Amotai team that are here as well, you know, we're all on this journey of supply diversity, and we understand that our Australian cousins have been on it a little bit longer than us, maybe, you know, a third longer. We're maybe a third into the time frame of what you guys have been on that journey, but we've seen some great strides in our space. You know, granted, we've got a couple of barriers with our government and things right now, but definitely really keen to continue to learning from our cousins across the ditch and what's been happening and what's working, and if we can implement and take on some of those strategies, really happy to implement those things. So talk about cool.
And if any of the people on the call want to contact me outside of this, I'm happy, Anna Jane, if you want to share details. You know, I think the more of us that are in this space that can just compare notes and have discussions and even kind of vent sometimes and say, do you know what this bloke did today? Like, that kind of conversation. I'm happy to have that as well.
Beautiful. No, I think yeah, a lot of our buyer members have really been impressed and really appreciate that and sharing their sentiments now. So yeah, I guess Anna's just put in there, and I guess just wrapping up. Thank you again, Chris, for your sharing of your expertise and your experience, and things that are happening well with Wilson Group. And yeah, we look forward to maybe what we can do to work alongside you to help get NZ happening a bit more, but looking forward to that journey as well. And just kind of finishing off at Stefano, yeah, the reminder that this is a third 3 series webinar online opportunity. So we've got our final one coming after Summit, so in September, where we'll be learning a bit more about communities of practice and our Kahui framework that we've put into place here as well. So feel free to join and register for that as well. We look forward to hopefully having another awesome quarter like today and last month's one also. So time is at the end now, but I'll look forward to closing us up with a bit of an acknowledgement and karakia. And so, yeah, wishing you all the best on the rest of the day today and the rest of the week ahead. And I will close us up with a bit of a karakia. So, mi noi tātou. Tēnei te huinga o te tangata ka oki, tēnei te mauri o te wānanga ka moi, ko te ngākau me te wairua kia wātea, ko te tinana me te hinangara kia tā, whānau, haramai te toki, haumi e hui e, tai ki e. Kia ora. Ngā mihi e te whānau, thank you so much for your time. Thank you again, Chris, and we look forward to seeing you all again on the next Buyer Series, the concluding Buyer Series. Kia ora.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, team. Thanks. Beauty.